At 5:11 in the morning, freezing in the Ohio sleet, my 78-year-old grandmother was left on my porch like unwanted freight. My doorbell camera caught my parents driving away. What chilled me wasn't her thin sweater, but the folder shoved into her bag a 9 o'clock annuity surrender appointment. They thought they had finally dumped their burden on me. They didn't know I investigate financial fraud for a living, and one call would ruin them. My name is Denise Hart. I am 37 years old, living in the quiet, manicured suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. By day, I work as a senior compliance investigator at Aldercrest Benefit Integrity Group. My entire career is built on sniffing out inconsistencies, tracking down hidden financial discrepancies, and exposing the people who think they can outsmart the system. I spend my life looking for the ugly truths hidden beneath pristine surfaces, but you never expect the most damning case file of your life to be dropped on your own front porch. It was pitch black outside when the piercing chime of my security application shattered the silence of my bedroom. The motion alert flashed across my phone screen. I squinted against the harsh glare of the display, my brain struggling to catch up with the sudden wakefulness. I tapped the notification, bringing up the live feed from my doorbell camera. The scene playing out on the small screen felt surreal, like a grainy security tape from a crime documentary. A familiar silver sport utility vehicle idled in my driveway. It belonged to my parents, Randall and Beth Hart. The passenger door swung open. A figure was practically guided, or rather hurried, out into the freezing wet sleet of a brutal March morning. It was my grandmother, Lorraine Hart. She is 78 years old. My parents did not get out of the car. They popped the trunk, and my father leaned over from the driver's seat, just enough to toss 2 heavy duffel bags and a thick document folder onto the cold concrete beside her. They did not walk her to the door. They did not press the doorbell. They did not leave a voicemail or a text message explaining their presence. In less than 2 minutes, the passenger door slammed shut, the brake lights flared, and the vehicle reversed out of the driveway, speeding away into the dark. They left an elderly woman standing completely alone, shivering violently as the freezing rain lashed against her frail frame. Panic and fury spiked through my chest. I threw off my heavy quilt, ignoring the bite of the cold hardwood floor against my bare feet, and sprinted down the staircase. I tore the deadbolt open and shoved the front door wide. The Ohio wind howled, cutting through my pajamas instantly. Grandma Lorraine stood on the welcome mat, hugging her arms tightly across her chest. She was wearing only a thin, short-sleeved floral nightgown and a paper-thin pink cardigan that offered zero protection against the ice. I looked down, on her left foot. She wore one sturdy orthopedic walking shoe. On her right foot, a fuzzy indoor house slipper soaked through with freezing water. The mismatch was a glaring red flag. It was the undeniable signature of someone who had been rushed, yanked from sleep in a haze of confusion, and pushed out the door before her brain could even register the environment. I grabbed her trembling shoulders and rushed her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. The immediate warmth of the hallway seemed to shock her system further. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked together. "Grandma," I whispered, wrapping my arms around her to share my body heat. "It is okay. You are safe now." As I guided her toward the living room sofa, my professional training hijacked my daughterly panic. The senior compliance investigator in me stepped forward, eyes scanning for data points, cataloging evidence of mistreatment. When you audit fraud and abuse for a living, you learn that the body keeps a very accurate ledger. I sat her down and wrapped her in the thickest fleece blanket I owned. The overhead living room light revealed the horrifying details. Her eyes were fiercely bloodshot, the skin around them swollen and raw from heavy, prolonged crying. I took her freezing, fragile hands to rub some warmth into them. As her sleeves rode up, I stopped. On her left wrist, there was a deep, pale indentation in the skin. Her medical alert watch, the one she wore religiously every single day, was missing. Someone had removed it recently enough that the skin had not yet rebounded. I knelt to remove the soaking wet slipper and the single shoe. My breath caught in my throat. Her ankles were massively swollen, the skin stretched tight and shiny. bulging painfully over the seams of her socks. I listened to her breathe. Each inhalation was shallow and labored, carrying a distinct, heavy wheeze in the quiet room. These were not the signs of an elderly woman simply startled by the cold. These were the textbook clinical indicators of a patient who had been deliberately deprived of her prescribed daily diuretics or whose vital heart medication had been systematically withheld. Fury, cold and sharp, began to pool in my stomach. I left her resting on the sofa and marched back to the entryway to retrieve the bags left on the concrete. They were heavy, packed haphazardly. One of the zippers was busted open, revealing a chaotic mess of clothing, but it was the rigid dark blue folder shoved carelessly between a pile of sweaters that caught my eye. I pulled it out. It was heavy cardstock, bearing the embossed logo of a major national annuity firm. I flipped it open on the kitchen island. Inside, a stack of freshly printed papers rested. I scanned the top sheet. It was a formal confirmation of a telephonic account surrender, scheduled for exactly 9 o'clock this very morning. Attached to it was a remote electronic signature authorization form, already partially filled out. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. I picked it up. The digital clock read 27 minutes past 5 in the morning. A text message notification sat on the lock screen. It was from my mother, Beth. Grandma is safer with you for now. Mason cannot keep living under pressure. I read the words 3 times. Mason is my 32-year-old brother. He is the golden boy, the charismatic dreamer who never quite manages to make his grand visions profitable. My parents have spent their entire lives cushioning his falls. Suddenly, the entire sickening picture snapped into perfect clarity. The mismatched shoes, the missing medical alert watch, the withheld medication, the sudden silent drop-off in the pitch black of dawn. This was not a desperate, frantic decision made by an overwhelmed family at their breaking point. This was a meticulously orchestrated, precisely timed tactical maneuver. They needed Grandma Lorraine physically removed from the premises before that 9 o'clock phone call. They dumped the physical burden of a sick, elderly woman onto the quiet, dependable daughter so they could clear the playing field. They were going to liquidate her remaining financial safety net, and they could not risk the actual account holder sitting in the next room, suddenly regaining enough lucidity to ask what they were doing with her money. Most daughters in my position would have dialed their mother immediately. They would have screamed into the receiver. They would have demanded an explanation, cried, or begged for them to come back and take responsibility. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the damning paperwork under the harsh recessed lighting. I did not unlock my phone. I did not type a furious reply. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, a chilling calm washed over me. I walked over to my home office, pulled a fresh, thick notebook from my desk drawer, and grabbed my favorite black ink pen. I was not going to call them and engage in a pointless, emotional screaming match. They thought they were dealing with the compliant, silent daughter who always cleaned up their messes. They forgot what I do for a living. I flipped to the first blank page of the notebook. I wrote down the exact time of the doorbell alert. I logged the physical condition of my grandmother's ankles, her breathing, the missing watch, and the specific attire she was wearing. I documented the text message and the scheduled time of the annuity call. I was officially opening a case file. My professional intuition, honed over thousands of hours of dissecting corporate lies and financial deception, was screaming at me. This cruel, freezing abandonment on my porch was not the climax of their desperate situation. It was merely the visible surface of a massive, coordinated fraud, and I was going to tear their entire world apart to prove it. In every family ecosystem, roles are assigned early and rarely renegotiated. I was minted as the stable one before I even hit middle school. I secured the solid grades, funded my own college degree, paid my own mortgage, and never asked for a single dime or favor. In the Hart household, independence was not celebrated. It was simply weaponized. My lack of neediness made me the default shock absorber. Whenever things got heavy, the burden was silently slid across the table to me, with the unspoken expectation that I would carry it without a single complaint. I was the designated adult, even when I was a child. My brother, Mason, occupies the exact opposite end of the spectrum. At 32 years old, he is a man perpetually standing on the precipice of his next massive breakthrough. Mason does not have jobs, he has grand visions. His current obsession is a venture he christened Forge House Athletics. To hear him pitch it, it is not just a recreational gym. It is an elite, hybrid lifestyle brand combining a boutique indoor pickleball studio, a high-tech athletic recovery lounge, and a dedicated, aesthetically perfect space for fitness influencers to shoot social media content. To my parents, Randall and Beth, Mason is a bold visionary taking necessary risks. They are completely blinded by the glossy digital mock-ups and his slick, rehearsed sales pitches. They conveniently ignore the harsh reality that he is systematically incinerating capital. He burns through cash securing premium commercial leases he absolutely cannot afford. He buys top-tier imported massage chairs and cold plunge tubs, runs expensive targeted digital advertising campaigns, and hosts lavish networking dinners that yield zero actual investors. Mason plays the part of a wildly successful entrepreneur, and my parents gladly pay the steep admission fee just to watch the show. The glaring problem was, their own retirement funds had dried up years ago. Enter Grandma Lorraine. Before my grandfather passed away, they shared 50 solid, beautiful years of marriage. Back then, Grandma was a genuine force of nature. She was sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, and practically ran her local community board with an iron fist. When she was widowed, the massive, empty house became too much for her to manage alone. She sold the property at a premium and relocated closer to our family. Bringing along a highly substantial annuity meant to guarantee her absolute comfort and medical security in her final chapters. When she first arrived at my parents' house, they were practically tripping over themselves to play the role of the devoted, loving caretakers. They proudly announced to our extended family and their country club friends that they were bringing her into their home to provide hands-on support. It was a beautiful, heartwarming narrative. But as the months dragged on, the subtext of their conversations began to shift. Grandma Lorraine stopped being spoken of as a revered matriarch. Instead, her accumulated resources became an unspoken, limitless slush fund for the household, heavily funneled toward keeping Mason afloat. I should have acted on the tiny hairline fractures I saw forming during the holidays. Looking back, the warning signs were flashing bright red over both Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. Grandma had physically diminished in a way that shocked me. The vibrant woman who used to confidently dominate the carving of the turkey looked incredibly frail, her collarbones jutting sharply against her festive holiday blouse. She had clearly lost significant weight, her clothes hanging loose from her frame. When I explicitly asked about her recent cardiology checkup, Beth quickly chimed in, smoothly steering the conversation toward Mason and his pending equipment deliveries from overseas. Grandma was noticeably quieter. Her hearing seemed drastically worse, but she wore no new hearing aids. More disturbing was the dynamic of control. Whenever she opened her mouth to mention anything even slightly critical of her living situation, my father would instantly talk over her with booming, aggressive cheerfulness. He would physically step between us, offering more wine, changing the subject with a forceful, manufactured laugh. "Old people cost a lot more than anyone thinks," my mother remarked casually over dessert on Christmas Eve, swirling the red wine in her expensive glass. She laughed lightly, but her eyes were cold and calculating. The specialized dietary needs and the constant temperature control alone feel like a second mortgage. Later that same evening, my father cornered me in the hallway, clapping a heavy, desperate hand on my shoulder. "Mason is right there. Denise, he just needs one last push before Forge House goes national and the franchising begins. Just one final bridge of capital, and he is totally set for life." I did not put the pieces together then. I naively did not ask where that final bridge of capital was coming from. I assumed they were taking out a second mortgage, not draining a vulnerable woman. I had even heard a passing rumor from my aunt that Grandma had been relocated within the house. When she first moved in, she was given the spacious primary guest suite on the first floor, fully equipped with a safe ensuite bathroom and wide, accessible doorways. But recently, she had been quietly shuffled up the steep stairs into a cramped, drafty spare room near the attic. Why? Because Mason desperately needed the natural light and the premium square footage of the first-floor suite to set up expensive ring lights and shoot promotional videos pitching his luxury business dream. They had quite literally boxed an elderly woman into a tiny corner so my brother could pretend to be wealthy on the internet. I thought about the times I called her over the past few months. Beth always seemed to be the one answering Grandma's cell phone, claiming she was resting, or in the garden, or watching her favorite television programs. I accepted those excuses because it was easier to believe my family was fundamentally good. That was my biggest mistake. I let my guard down because they shared my blood. I investigate complex financial crimes for 50 hours a week, yet I completely missed the glaring embezzlement operation running right inside my childhood home. The realization stung, a sharp mix of profound guilt and escalating rage, but the guilt was fleeting. The rage, however, was solidifying into something cold, focused, and incredibly dangerous. I had spent my entire adult life being the compliant daughter who absorbed their stress. They banked on that dynamic remaining unbroken. They were relying on my predictable silence. Sitting in my living room now, staring at the rain lashing against the window. The retrospective clarity was absolutely nauseating. The pieces locked together with a grim, sickening logic that made my blood run cold. What happened on my driveway this morning was not a sudden emergency. It was not a temporary lapse in judgment from exhausted caregivers hitting a wall. It was the deliberate, inevitable climax of a slow-moving, deeply malicious extraction process. For months, this supposedly perfect family had been carefully, systematically dismantling a vibrant human being, reducing her down to nothing more than a blind funding source. And once the source was nearly drained, she transformed from a useful asset into a dangerous obstacle. She was an obstacle standing directly between Mason and his delusions of grandeur. She was a massive liability. They needed completely out of the way before the final, massive financial withdrawal could be executed safely. By dumping her on my porch in the freezing cold, they had not just abandoned my grandmother, they were sanitizing the crime scene and disposing of the primary witness. I carried the bags from the entryway and dropped them onto the granite island in my kitchen. The investigator inside my head completely took over. I was no longer a horrified granddaughter. I was an auditor walking into a hostile corporate site. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and switched it to camera mode. Before touching a single item, I photographed the exterior of the bags, documenting the broken zippers and the haphazard way the fabric bulged. I made sure the digital clock on my microwave was visible in the background of the first frame. Stamping the timeline, it was 5:45 in the morning. I unzipped the main compartment of the largest duffel. The smell of stale lavender and damp wool wafted out. I began extracting items one by one, treating my kitchen counter like an evidence processing table. Sweaters went into one pile, undergarments into another. Then, my hand brushed against a hard plastic rectangle. It was a 7-day pill organizer, the kind with individual snap closures for morning and evening doses. I laid it flat under the bright overhead lights and opened every single compartment. The pattern I found inside was not the result of simple forgetfulness. It was deliberate, systemic neglect. The small white tablets, the diuretics designed to keep the fluid from building up around her heart and in her extremities, were entirely missing from the last 4 days. Meanwhile, her heavy-duty beta blockers were jumbled haphazardly, 2 stuffed into a Tuesday slot, none in Wednesday or Thursday. I opened the tiny side pocket of her toiletry bag and found her backup hearing aid batteries. I tested one with my thumb. Dead. The others were completely corroded. They had intentionally silenced her world and sabotaged her cardiovascular stability. Digging deeper into the side pouch of the second bag, I retrieved a stack of mail held together by a thick rubber band. Most of it was junk, but wedged in the middle was an unopened envelope bearing the return address of a prominent local cardiology group. I carefully slit the top edge with a paring knife. Inside was a formal discharge warning. It detailed 3 consecutive missed appointments over the past 6 weeks. At the bottom, a clinical coordinator had handwritten a note citing a phone call with a primary caregiver. The note read that the patient was uncooperative and refusing transport. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my chest. My grandmother had never missed a doctor's appointment in her life. She was the kind of woman who arrived 20 minutes early just to be polite to the receptionists. Calling her uncooperative was an absolute, verifiable fabrication. The most damning piece of paper, however, was tucked inside the blue annuity folder my father had thrown onto the porch. It was a single printed sheet of standard printer paper, clearly generated from a spreadsheet application. The header simply read, "Household Adjustments." It was an itemized ledger created by my mother, but she had not listed normal expenses. She had commodified a human life. Next to my grandmother's name were specific, cruel line items, food share, laundry burden, extra utilities, and med support. There were exact dollar amounts next to each one, calculating how much her mere existence was draining their resources. It did not look like a family budget. It looked exactly like a corporate profit and loss statement, with my grandmother categorized as an unacceptable deficit. I left the documents on the counter and walked softly back into the living room. Grandma Lorraine was sitting upright now, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of hot chamomile tea I had brewed. The heavy fleece blanket was still draped over her trembling shoulders. I sat down on the coffee table directly facing her, keeping my voice low and steady. "Grandma," I started, making sure she was looking at my lips since her hearing aid was useless. "Can you tell me about your phone? Where is your cell phone?" She looked down at her lap, her brow furrowing in confusion. Beth took it. She said the screen light was bad for my eyes at night. She started keeping it in her bedroom so I could get proper rest. But she never brought it back during the day. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. "And the papers? Grandma have Dad or Mom asked you to sign anything recently?" Her hands shook slightly against the warm mug. "Randall brought me some forms last week. He seemed so stressed. He just pointed to the bottom line and told me to sign right there. He said they were just routine care papers for the insurance company." I reached out and gently placed my hand over hers. "Did they tell you where you were going this morning?" Tears welled up in her bloodshot eyes, spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Randall woke me up when it was still dark. He said I had to put my coat on because the clinic had an emergency cancellation, and they could finally fit me in for my heart checkup. I thought we were going to the doctor." The sheer cruelty of the lie hit me like a physical blow. She thought she was being taken to receive the medical care they had been secretly denying her. It was not until the vehicle stopped abruptly in my driveway, and her bags were unceremoniously dumped onto the freezing concrete, that she realized she was being permanently discarded. They did not even have the courage to tell her she was being evicted. I needed a moment to process the absolute sociopathy of their actions. I walked over to the entryway tablet mounted on the wall and pulled up the recorded footage from the doorbell camera. I played the 2-minute clip again, watching it frame by frame. I focused on the front seats of the vehicle. Through the glare of the windshield, I watched my mother. Beth stared straight ahead the entire time, her posture rigid, her hands locked on her lap. She did not cast a single glance toward the passenger side as her husband ushered his own mother out into the sleet. My father was no better. His eyes were entirely fixated on the blue folder, ensuring it landed squarely on top of the luggage. He looked like a man terrified of forgetting a crucial prop, completely indifferent to the human being shivering in the wind. I marched back into my home office and booted up my laptop. I opened a fresh, encrypted document. I titled it simply with the current date. I began constructing a formal evidence log. I typed out a detailed description of her physical state upon arrival, emphasizing the swollen ankles and labored breathing. I uploaded the high-resolution photos of the missing pills, the dead batteries, and the alarming spreadsheet. I transcribed the cancellation letter from the cardiologist and logged the exact text message my mother had sent at 27 minutes past 5. Finally, I typed out a verbatim account of my grandmother's statement. But as I reviewed the timeline, A massive, glaring inconsistency struck me. I walked back to the kitchen and grabbed the top sheet from the blue folder. The confirmation for the annuity account surrender was scheduled for exactly 9 o'clock this morning. I stared at the paper, my mind racing through the procedural mechanics of financial institutions. To liquidate an account of that size, the company requires either an in-person verification or a heavily authenticated phone call with the primary account holder. My parents had just dumped the account holder on my porch. She was sitting in my living room, miles away from them. The realization was an explosive charge going off in my brain. They did not cancel the call. The appointment was still on the books. This meant they were not just planning to steal her money, they were preparing to actively impersonate her, or use those fraudulently obtained signatures to execute the final withdrawal while she was securely locked out of the house. They thought they had removed the only variable that could blow their cover. They were wrong. I pulled the bulky silver laptop from the bottom of the second duffel bag. It was an older model, the one my grandmother primarily used for reading news articles and sending occasional emails to distant relatives. I set it up on my kitchen counter right next to my own workstation. The fan whirred loudly as the machine booted up. "Grandma, I need to look at your accounts," I told her, keeping my voice steady and clear so she could read my lips. "Do you remember your email password?" She shook her head, pulling the fleece blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Beth set it all up for me when I moved in. She told me the security rules were getting too complicated and said it was much easier if she just managed the digital things for me." Of course she did. Taking control of the communication channels is always the first step in any financial exploitation scheme. I bypassed the login prompt by accessing the saved passwords stored directly in the browser settings. As the inbox loaded, the sheer volume of unread, high-priority administrative messages made the investigator inside me go entirely still. I immediately filtered the search bar using the name of the prominent annuity firm. A massive cascade of automated confirmations filled the screen. There were dozens of emails acknowledging recent requests to change the primary contact phone number, update the official mailing address, and alter the designated disbursement methods. I clicked open a message dated from Tuesday of last week. "Grandma, did you authorize a change to your direct deposit routing?" I asked. She looked at me blankly, her eyes exhausted. "I do not even know what that means. I have not spoken to the bank in over a year." I navigated away from the email and went straight to the financial institution's client portal. I initiated a password reset, routing the secure link back to the email inbox I now controlled. Once I gained access to the main dashboard, the truth was laid out in stark, undeniable ledgers. The primary account transaction history was a complete bloodbath. I saw a massive wire transfer for $45,000 executed exactly 6 weeks ago. Another withdrawal for $22,000 followed just 2 weeks later. The destination account was not a medical facility, a pharmacy, or a licensed care agency. The recipient for every single major outflow was listed under a corporate entity Forge House Build-Out Limited Liability Company. That was Mason. It was the exact holding company he had formed to handle the logistics of his absurd athletic complex. The funds my grandmother had carefully saved over 5 decades for her end-of-life care were being systematically drained to pay for commercial retail space deposits, imported recovery massage chairs, polished indoor pickleball flooring, and high-end digital marketing retainers. But the outright embezzlement was only half the operation. They were also laundering the extraction through deeply cynical fabricated expenses. I found a hidden subfolder in the email client titled Household Reimbursements. Inside were polished, professional-looking digital invoices generated by my own parents. They were using standard accounting software templates to charge my grandmother exorbitant monthly fees for services that simply did not exist. There was a line item for $2,500 labeled as a mobility retrofitting fee. Another invoice demanded $800 a month for private medical transport. There was even a recurring charge for specialized physical therapy support and custom nutritional meal delivery. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and scrolled back through my camera roll to the photographs I had taken at my parents' house during Thanksgiving dinner. I zoomed in on the background of the living room, the main hallway, and the steep wooden staircase. There were no safety grab bars installed on the walls. There was no mechanical stair lift bolted to the steps. The specialized nutritional catering they were billing her for was actually just my mother serving standard frozen casseroles. They were systematically invoicing a vulnerable woman for the privilege of being medically neglected. The most chilling discovery, however, was a secure link to a third-party remote online notary service. A transaction had been officially completed 48 hours ago to authorize the total, permanent surrender of the entire annuity contract. I clicked the verification link, and a small video player popped up on the screen, displaying the mandatory recording of the remote signing session. The video quality was intentionally atrocious. The webcam feed was grainy, and the room lighting was incredibly dim, casting long, obscuring shadows across the frame. On the screen, I saw the side profile of my grandmother sitting rigidly in a dining chair. A woman's hand, unmistakably my mother's, was visible at the edge of the frame, resting heavily and firmly on my grandmother's shoulder. The audio was severely muffled, crackling with intentional static. A disembodied voice from the remote notary asked a rapid, complex legal question about consenting to the financial surrender terms. My grandmother did not speak. She did not even look at the camera. She simply gave a slow, mechanical nod. Knowing what I now knew about her corroded hearing aid batteries, it was painfully obvious she had not heard a single syllable the notary said. My mother had likely just squeezed her shoulder as a prearranged physical cue to force her to nod at the glowing green light of the webcam. It was pure, documented coercion captured in high definition. Everything was escalating too fast. I needed to understand the catalyst. Why the sudden, violent rush? Why dump her in the freezing sleet today? Specifically, I opened the messaging application on my own phone, scrolling back through a muted family group chat. I bypassed months of mundane updates until I found a frantic exchange I had largely ignored 3 weeks prior. Mason had been spiraling into a panic. If the final capital injection does not hit the escrow account by Friday, the commercial landlord is pulling the lease. Mason had written in the group chat. The general contractors will walk off the site, and they will keep the entire initial deposit. We lose the space completely. I need that money cleared immediately. Beth had replied exactly 2 minutes later. We are handling it. The final clearance takes time because of the strict age verification protocols. But we will have the entire balance liquid by the end of the month. Do not panic. Keep the contractors on site. I sat back in my desk chair, the harsh blue glow of the dual monitors illuminating the dark room. The entire grotesque architecture of their crime was now fully visible. This situation was never about caregiver burnout. The narrative they spun to our extended family about the crushing stress of managing an elderly relative was a highly calculated smokescreen. They had bled her dry, siphoning off her wealth piece by piece to fund a fake empire. But to get the final, largest lump sum, they needed to completely liquidate the annuity account and close it forever. The financial firm was demanding a live, verified telephone confirmation at exactly 9 o'clock this morning to authorize that final, massive wire transfer. They could not risk my grandmother being inside the house for that phone call. They could not risk her hearing a stray word, asking a confused question, or picking up a landline extension and accidentally telling the bank representative that she had absolutely no idea what was happening to her life savings. She was not a burden they were abandoning because they were tired of taking care of her. She was a hijacked bank account, and they were desperately trying to close the vault before the alarms went off. They threw her out into the freezing storm because her mere physical presence was the only piece of evidence that could stop the final transaction from going through. The clock mounted on my kitchen wall indicated it was exactly 14 minutes past 8 in the morning. I had 46 minutes before the financial institution initiated their outbound verification procedure. In the corporate compliance sector, confronting a hostile target directly is considered the ultimate amateur mistake. Engaging in an emotional, screaming argument with my parents would only give them the tactical advantage. It would provide them with a critical window of time to destroy their digital paper trails. manipulate their business partners, or accelerate their timeline to force the transaction through another channel. I needed to execute a clean, silent strike to the main artery of their operation. I picked up my smartphone, bypassing my personal contact list entirely. Instead, I opened my web browser, navigated to the official registry of the massive annuity firm holding my grandmother's life savings, and located the specialized internal directory. I dialed the direct toll-free number for their vulnerable adult protection hotline. The line rang twice before clicking open. Vulnerable Client Protection Unit. This is Agent Miller speaking. How may I direct your emergency? A crisp, highly trained voice answered. My name is Denise Hart, I stated, dropping my voice into the exact, authoritative cadence I utilize when briefing federal auditors. I am calling to formally report an active, in-progress incident of elder financial exploitation, explicit familial coercion, a highly suspected unauthorized surrender request, and remote notary fraud regarding your account holder, Lorraine Hart. I heard the immediate, rapid clatter of a mechanical keyboard on his end. Agent Miller's demeanor shifted instantly from routine customer service protocol to a high-alert compliance posture. Ms. Hart, I am opening a priority incident log right now. Please provide the primary account details and your specific relationship to the client. After establishing my identity as her granddaughter and providing the necessary identification numbers, I systematically deployed the 3 specific pieces of evidence that function as absolute, undeniable red flags in the financial security sector. First, I told him, keeping my tone entirely devoid of emotion, the account holder was physically abandoned at my personal residence in the freezing sleet less than 3 hours ago by the primary suspects. I have high-definition time-stamped security footage of this event. Second, she is currently in severe medical distress due to her daily cardiovascular medications being intentionally withheld by her previous caregivers, rendering her clinically and legally incapable of providing informed, lucid consent for any transactions scheduled for this morning. Third, I have just interviewed the client directly, and she categorically denies ever initiating, understanding, or authorizing the total liquidation of her assets. The background noise on the line completely vanished, leaving only the heavy silence of an investigator realizing the massive scale of the liability sitting on his desk. Ms. Hart, based on the specific trigger warnings you have just provided, I am taking immediate preventative action, Agent Miller replied, his voice tight and serious. I am officially suspending the outbound verification call scheduled for 9 o'clock this morning. I am placing a hard, indefinite freeze on all pending disbursement requests across her entire portfolio. No funds will leave this institution. Understood, I replied. Furthermore, Miller continued, the keyboard clacking rapidly in the background, because this file involves a vulnerable client over the age of 65. Our institution is legally obligated to initiate immediate external escalations. This action automatically triggers mandatory reports to your State Adult Protective Services Division and the Regional Department of Insurance Fraud. They will be opening independent state-level inquiries today. I require 1 additional administrative barricade placed on the client profile, I instructed, making sure my final directive was permanently logged into the system. Any future requests to alter designated beneficiaries, modify primary contact information, or initiate wire transfers must mandate that the client appear in person at a physical branch with independent, state-issued identification. You absolutely cannot accept any further remote authorizations, telephonic commands, or digital signatures submitted by anyone claiming to be her familial representative. Agent Miller confirmed the hard restrictions were permanently locked into the mainframe. I thanked him for his prompt intervention and terminated the connection. It was done. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, set my device face up on the granite island, and waited for the shockwave to hit them. The trap was set, the authorities were notified, and the vault was permanently sealed. All I had to do was watch the fallout. At exactly 7 minutes past 9 in the morning, the screen of my smartphone illuminated brightly. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I watched the device vibrate violently against the stone countertop until the call rolled over to the voicemail system. Less than 60 seconds later, she dialed again. Then, a rapid succession of text messages began flooding my screen, demanding to know if I had intercepted a call from the bank and ordering me to answer the phone immediately. I did not move a single muscle. I took a slow sip of my coffee. At 19 minutes past 9 in the morning, a new name flashed across the display: Mason. My brother had not initiated a direct phone call to me in over 4 months. Now, he was calling 3 times in the span of 2 minutes. When he finally realized I was completely ignoring his aggressive calls, he sent a frantic, heavily capitalized text message. He was absolutely furious, complaining bitterly about a massive amount of crucial funding suddenly hanging in midair because the financial portal had locked his administrative access out completely. As the morning stretched toward 12 o'clock, the digital architecture of their fabricated reality completely imploded. Right at noon, an encrypted email arrived in my professional inbox from a Tier 3 internal investigator at the annuity firm. The message provided an official federal reference number and legally confirmed that the entire financial portfolio was now quarantined under an active multi-agency elder abuse inquiry. Simultaneously, a notification popped up on the shared family messaging application that I still silently monitored. Mason was having a complete, unfiltered meltdown in the group chat because the massive wire transfer had failed to materialize at 9 o'clock. His general contractors had officially walked off the commercial site, citing a breach of contract, and formally notified him that they were seizing his entire initial deposit as a penalty. To compound the disaster, the commercial landlord holding the lease for his proposed athletic facility had officially refused to extend the grace period for the final payment. The retail space was gone. This was the absolute, devastating power of working within the system. I did not have to drive across town to their house. I did not have to engage in a toxic, dramatic screaming match on their front lawn. I did not have to listen to my mother's manipulative tears or my father's booming justifications. With one single, perfectly placed phone call to the exact right department, I silently severed the vital financial artery feeding their entire universe of lies. I cut off the money, destroyed the fraudulent business venture, and summoned the authorities right to their doorstep. I hit them back harder than they could have ever comprehended, and I accomplished all of it without ever raising my voice. The phone resting on the cold granite island in my kitchen did not stop vibrating. It was a relentless, rhythmic buzzing that seemed to hum through the very foundation of the house. I simply stood there, a mug of black coffee in my hand, watching the screen illuminate with text message after text message from Beth. There was not a single, fleeting inquiry about whether an elderly woman had survived standing in the freezing sleet, or if she had even managed to eat breakfast. Instead, the messages were a barrage of frantic, desperate directives. "Mom just needs to confirm over the phone. That is all," read the first text. "Do not make a big deal out of nothing. You are blowing this out of proportion." Followed exactly 1 minute later. "You are ruining your brother's future over a misunderstanding." Then, the device actually rang. The caller identification displayed Randall. I did not panic. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my secondary work device, and hit the audio record button. I placed it directly next to the speaker of my personal phone and answered the call. "Denise," my father barked immediately. His voice was thick and dripping with that familiar, heavy condescension he always deployed whenever he felt his absolute authority slipping away. "Put your grandmother on the phone right this second. This is a private, internal family matter, and you are vastly overstepping your boundaries by interfering." I did not raise my voice to match his anger. I did not engage in the emotional, explosive argument he was so incredibly desperate to provoke. "She is resting, Randall," I replied simply, my tone flat and purely professional. And considering the fraudulent documents I found in her luggage, her financial accounts are no longer a private family matter. I tapped the red icon to sever the connection before he could draw another ragged breath to scream. I immediately saved the audio file to my encrypted drive, took high-resolution screenshots of every single text message from Beth, and then systematically blocked both of their numbers from accessing my personal line. I was locking them entirely out of the narrative they were trying to control. Mason was the next to strike. Because his number was not yet blocked, he bypassed the standard text messages and left a massive, rambling, and absolutely furious voicemail. I played it back on speakerphone. His voice was completely unhinged, cracking with the raw, visceral panic of a man watching his entire house of cards collapse into dust in real time. He raged blindly about a suspended wire transfer that was making him look like an amateur fraud in front of his new commercial partners. "You do not understand what you just did," Mason yelled into the recording, his breathing ragged. "Forge House is standing on the very edge of a cliff. The investors are walking away today. If Grandma's money does not flow into the escrow account by 3 o'clock this afternoon, I lose the entire property. You are bankrupting me. Denise, you are destroying my life." I listened to the message twice to ensure I caught every word. In his blind, self-centered rage, my golden boy brother had just handed me the final, irrefutable puzzle piece. He explicitly, verbally admitted that his entire corporate venture hinged entirely on the immediate, illicit liquidation of an elderly woman's life savings. It was a beautiful, entirely unforced error. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a nondescript silver sedan pulled into my driveway. A stern but warmly professional woman named Agent Sarah Jenkins from the State Adult Protective Services Division stepped out, carrying a thick, worn leather binder. I ushered her into the living room, where Grandma Lorraine was resting comfortably in a plush velvet armchair. After a warm shower, a solid, nutritious breakfast, and the correct, timely dosage of her heart medication, the color had finally returned to her cheeks. She still looked deeply fragile, but the heavy, suffocating fog of medical neglect was clearly lifting. Agent Jenkins sat down gently across from her, opened her notebook, and asked her to explain the events leading up to this morning. Grandma folded her hands neatly in her lap, looking steadily at the investigator. "They kept telling me over and over that I was a terrible financial burden to the household," she explained, her voice finding a new, quiet strength. Then, a few days ago, Beth sat me down at the dining room table. She opened a laptop computer and pushed my wooden chair so close to the screen I could barely breathe. She told me to just say yes quickly to the person on the computer, or else I would lose my health insurance coverage completely. I could not hear what the person was asking, but Beth was squeezing my shoulder so hard it left a bruise. Agent Jenkins stopped writing, her jaw tightening. She asked to see the bruise and documented the faint, yellowish marks lingering on my grandmother's shoulder. While the interview continued, I went back to the old silver laptop resting on the kitchen counter. I accessed my grandmother's cloud-based digital voicemail archive. People like Beth and Randall always get sloppy because they operate under the arrogant assumption that no one is ever going to double-check their work. I scanned through the digital trash bin and found an audio file Beth had accidentally left behind from last Tuesday. I called Agent Jenkins into the kitchen and pressed play. "Mason," my mother's voice hissed sharply through the laptop speakers, sounding incredibly rushed and intensely irritated. "Remember to change Grandma's hearing aid batteries before the notary call tomorrow. If they are dead, she might mishear the legal questions and say the wrong things on camera. We need her to just nod and agree without asking any questions at all." "Fix it." Agent Jenkins looked up, making direct, hardened eye contact with me. The air in the kitchen grew instantly heavy. It was no longer just a circumstantial suspicion of elder coercion. I had just played an explicitly recorded conspiracy to deliberately manipulate a disabled adult. "I am going to request the back-end technical logs from that remote online notary platform immediately," Agent Jenkins stated, pulling out her official state-issued cellular device to dial her office. Within 2 hours, the preliminary digital forensics report hit her secure inbox. The data we reviewed was absolutely damning. The Internet Protocol address used to log into the supposed independent verification line did not belong to a secure, neutral third-party server. It traced directly back to the residential broadband network officially registered to my parents' home address. They had orchestrated the entire fraudulent legal proceeding from their own kitchen router. But the technical system logs revealed an even more disturbing mechanical detail. The biometric security software on the notary platform had actively flagged a critical error during the signing. The facial recognition camera failed to match the person sitting on the screen with the official government identification on file 3 separate times. The automated system had repeatedly tried to abort the session due to a lack of visual confirmation. However, the logs showed that someone on the other side of the keyboard had manually overridden the security protocol, intentionally forcing the authorization through, despite the system explicitly warning that the identity could not be legally verified. They shoved the fraudulent paperwork through a broken digital door. My secondary device suddenly buzzed against the granite. It was a massive email from Beth. She had finally realized the phone lines were permanently blocked and resorted to typing out a massive, unhinged manifesto. The tone of her writing had completely shifted. The aggressive, commanding demands were entirely gone, replaced by frantic, manipulative weeping translated into text. She claimed in the email that they were fundamentally good people who had been backed into a terrible, unforgiving corner. She wrote that they only wanted to save Mason from declaring bankruptcy and ruining his reputation before his life even truly started. She begged me to understand that a real family has to make incredibly hard, painful sacrifices to protect their own blood. I read the words and felt a cold, incredibly sharp satisfaction settle into my bones. She thought she was pleading for mercy. She did not realize she was formally confessing in writing. By trying to morally justify their horrible actions, she had inadvertently confirmed the exact financial motive they had spent months denying to the rest of the world. I printed the email, the system logs, and the transcript of the voicemails, handing them in a neat, organized stack to the investigator. What had started at 5 o'clock in the morning as a horrifying, isolated act of abandonment had rapidly evolved. Every single one of their panicked reactions, their furious phone calls, and their desperate, tearful emails were not helping them escape. They were actively building a steel cage around themselves. They had voluntarily handed me a verifiable pattern of psychological abuse, an undeniable financial motive, and a clear, documented technique of technical fraud. They were digging their own graves, and all I had to do was step back and watch them swing the shovel. The investigation did not stop at the primary annuity contract. In my profession, I have learned that when you pull a single loose thread in a financial fraud case, the entire fabricated garment inevitably unravels. Working meticulously alongside my newly retained legal counsel, we issued a rapid, aggressive discovery demand to the affiliated banking institutions. The expanded search illuminated an entirely new, deeply buried layer of their deception. There was a secondary, linked high-yield savings account hidden deep within the portfolio. It had been opened exactly 7 months ago. The authorization document featured a pristine electronic signature that supposedly belonged to my grandmother. However, just like the disastrous remote notary video, the digital footprint of the signature traced directly back to the residential wireless router sitting in my parents' living room. We immediately pulled the itemized transaction history for this hidden account. The money was not being held in reserve for medical emergencies or future care. It was operating as an unrestricted corporate slush fund. I tracked consecutive, massive wire transfers used to pay for climate-controlled commercial storage rentals, aggressive digital advertising campaigns on various social media platforms, and non-refundable down payments for imported athletic recovery equipment. Every single dollar flowed directly to Mason. The audacity of their scheme was absolutely breathtaking. They were literally double-dipping into her existence. I found a separate, heavily encrypted folder on the old laptop containing fabricated invoices. They had officially classified my grandmother as a living cost sharer within their household. They were manually transferring $2,500 every single month from her checking account into their own joint account, claiming it was her fair, calculated portion of the household utilities, internet, and grocery bills. They stole her life savings to fund a fake business, and then essentially charged her exorbitant rent for the privilege of being imprisoned in a drafty attic room. The absolute lowest point of my discovery came when I unearthed a drafted copy of their federal tax returns for the previous calendar year. They had the unbelievable nerve to file a specialized federal tax deduction form, explicitly claiming heavy financial losses related to in-home elder care expenses. They were literally begging the federal government for a lucrative tax break, swearing under penalty of perjury that they were spending thousands of dollars out of pocket to nurse a sick relative. They had managed to turn their calculated neglect into a highly profitable, two-way revenue stream. The walls truly began to crush them when a completely unexpected wildcard entered the game. On Thursday afternoon, my secure legal email inbox received a heavily encrypted message. The sender was Trevor Keene. Trevor was Mason's highly polished, silver-tongued business partner, the man who was supposed to run the marketing division of the athletic complex. Trevor was a lot of things, but he was absolutely not willing to go to federal prison for my family. Terrified of the incoming state investigation and desperate to secure legal immunity before the indictments dropped, Trevor voluntarily flipped. He forwarded a massive, unbroken chain of text messages directly to my attorney. The digital receipts were staggering. In one specific exchange, Trevor expressed deep anxiety about the missing startup capital required to hold the commercial lease. My father responded directly from his personal device, promising, "Do not worry. The old lady's money will clear the escrow account before Friday." It was undeniable, written proof of premeditated financial extraction from my own father. But Trevor provided something even more damaging. He included a sworn, notarized affidavit detailing a private lunch meeting he had with Mason just 3 weeks prior. According to Trevor, Mason had casually bragged about the impending financial hurdle. Mason had laughed, sipping an expensive cocktail, and explicitly stated that they just needed to push Grandma over to my sister's house for a few weeks. Mason believed that dumping her at my doorstep would perfectly sanitize the financial background check required for their next massive round of investor fundraising. He viewed her as nothing more than a piece of dirty laundry that needed to be temporarily hidden in my closet until the checks cleared. The legal noose tightened even further when the state-appointed independent medical investigators submitted their official clinical findings to the court. A highly respected geriatric specialist had spent 3 hours thoroughly examining my grandmother. The resulting medical report was a brutal, heartbreaking read. The doctor confirmed that the severe fluid retention in her lower extremities and the dangerous irregularities in her heart rhythm were absolutely not the result of a single accidental missed dosage on the morning she was abandoned. The clinical markers proved this was the biological culmination of systemic, heavily calculated medical neglect spanning over 6 consecutive weeks. Furthermore, the doctor noted severe signs of forced psychological isolation, detailing how her physical decline was intentionally weaponized to keep her completely hidden from the outside world. Sensing the impending legal annihilation, Beth attempted a desperate, pathetic pivot through her newly hired defense attorney. She tried to construct a false narrative claiming that my grandmother was suffering from severe, undiagnosed cognitive decline. Beth's lawyer argued that the elderly woman simply forgot her financial commitments, that she would eagerly agree to fund Mason's business one day and then completely lose her memory the next. It was a classic, disgusting tactic used by financial abusers blame the victim's failing brain, but they miscalculated terribly. Part of the state's intervention protocol involved a rigorous, independent cognitive evaluation. An impartial neuropsychologist administered the test. When the results were officially unsealed, they destroyed Beth's final line of defense entirely. My grandmother scored in the 98th percentile for her specific age demographic. Her memory recall, logical reasoning, and situational awareness were completely intact. She was legally and medically deemed entirely lucid. The report firmly concluded she possessed the full mental capacity to understand complex financial decisions and would have vehemently, forcefully objected if anyone had actually explained the truth to her. She was not forgetting anything. She was being deliberately kept in the dark. Instead of retreating into smart, calculated silence, Mason proved he possessed absolutely zero survival instinct. Late Friday night, an alert chimed on an anonymous social media monitoring account I frequently use for corporate investigations. Mason had uploaded a temporary video story to his public profile. He was sitting in the driver's seat of his leased luxury vehicle, his face flushed red with manic anger. He gripped the steering wheel and screamed directly into the camera lens about toxic, jealous relatives who exist solely to destroy the dreams of real entrepreneurs. He deleted the video exactly 14 minutes after posting it, most likely after his attorney frantically called him in a panic. But the internet never forgets. I had already screen recorded the entire unhinged tantrum. That small, pathetic digital outburst solidified a crucial truth. Mason still believed he was the tragic hero of a dramatic family misunderstanding. He had absolutely no concept that he was staring down the barrel of a legitimate, multi-agency federal criminal indictment. The chapter of our family history was closing rapidly, and the trap had sprung shut with a deafening snap. I was no longer holding a mere collection of suspicions about a cold morning drop-off. I now possessed a heavily fortified, weaponized arsenal of evidence. I had the chilling surveillance chronology, the unmistakable financial motive, the clearly documented routing numbers, a frightened witness willing to cooperate, conclusive medical findings, and the golden child's own catastrophic digital self-destruction. They thought they could quietly bury their sins in the freezing snow on my front porch, but all they did was hand me the shovel. The heavy oak doors of the county probate courthouse swung shut, sealing us inside a room where perfectly polished mahogany tables served as the final battleground. I sat beside my attorney, Marcus, a man whose quiet, terrifying competence was matched only by his absolute refusal to tolerate courtroom theatrics. Across the center aisle sat my parents, Randall and Beth, flanked by a frantic defense lawyer who looked like he had been hired exactly 12 hours ago. Mason was noticeably absent, likely hiding in his leased apartment, terrified of the glaring fluorescent lights of accountability. Marcus opened his leather briefcase and slid a massive, indexed binder across the polished wood toward the judge's clerk. We were not here for a polite mediation. We had filed an aggressive petition for emergency medical guardianship and a temporary protective restraining order regarding all financial assets. Marcus opened his argument with surgical precision, establishing firmly that if Randall, Beth, or Mason were permitted any further access to the accounts, or allowed any physical proximity to exert psychological pressure, my grandmother would be entirely liquidated before the month ended. Their defense attorney immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket in a desperate attempt to project control. He launched into a heavily rehearsed, deeply patronizing narrative. He attempted to paint my parents as exhausted, well-meaning martyrs suffering from severe caregiver burnout. Your Honor, what we have here is simply a tragic family misunderstanding, the defense attorney stated, gesturing vaguely toward my parents, who were simultaneously attempting to look thoroughly exhausted and deeply wounded. My clients were managing a highly stressful, multi-generational household in a confined space. Tensions ran high. The relocation was abrupt, yes, but it was merely meant to be a temporary weekend stay to alleviate the crushing pressure of full-time care. It was a clumsy transition, not an abandonment. I did not flinch. I let him finish building his flimsy house of cards. Then, Marcus stood up and systematically set it on fire with the undeniable, chronological truth. A temporary weekend stay does not require the immediate, permanent cancellation of critical cardiovascular specialists, Marcus countered, his voice ringing clearly off the high ceilings. He pulled the printed timeline from our binder. We have submitted the exact sequence of events. At 11 minutes past 5 in the morning, the vulnerable adult was deposited on a freezing concrete porch. The vehicle departed in under 2 minutes. At 27 minutes past 5, a text message was dispatched to my client, confirming the drop-off only after the suspects were safely miles away. And most crucially, Your Honor, at exactly 9 o'clock that very same morning, a scheduled, irrevocable telephonic surrender of an annuity worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was set to execute. Marcus paused, letting the heavy silence fill the room, ensuring the judge felt the immense weight of the premeditation. You do not arrange to permanently liquidate an elder's life savings on the exact same morning you decide you need a temporary weekend break. You do it because you are sanitizing the crime scene, The judge, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and absolutely zero patience for familial manipulation, shifted her gaze to my father. She leafed through the financial exhibits we had provided. "Mr. Hart," the judge addressed my father directly, her tone dangerously even. "I am reviewing these internal household invoices you generated. You claim to be a burdened family man, yet you charged your own mother $2,500 a month for, quote, mobility, retrofitting, and specialized safety services. Can you detail exactly what construction modifications you made to your property to justify these exorbitant fees?" Randall stood up. For my entire life, I had watched this man dominate every room he entered with a booming voice and absolute, unquestioned authority. Now, stripped of his home court advantage, he floundered. He cleared his throat twice, his face flushing a deep, embarrassing crimson. "Well, Your Honor, it was a general care fund," Randall stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward his lawyer. "We had to secure the environment. We purchased special dietary foods. And, well, the utility costs of keeping the house warmer for her were astronomical. It was a holistic billing approach." "A holistic billing approach," the judge repeated, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "The bank statements show that holistic money was transferred directly to a commercial sports equipment vendor the very next day. Did your mother require an imported cold plunge tub for her arthritis, Mr. Hart?" Randall opened his mouth, but no words came out. He slowly sank back into his heavy wooden chair. The illusion of the responsible patriarch entirely shattered. Seeing her husband completely dismantled, Beth panicked. She abandoned the legal strategy entirely and leaned heavily into emotional manipulation. She began to weep, loud, shuddering sobs that echoed in the sterile courtroom. "We were just trying to survive," Beth cried out, clutching a tissue to her face. "You do not understand the pressure we were under. Mason is a good boy. He is brilliant. He just needed a little help to get his business off the ground. We could not just let him go bankrupt and lose everything he worked for. We had to prioritize his future. We were going to figure everything out later. She was just a problem we had to manage temporarily so we could save our son." She thought her tears would buy her sympathy. Instead, she had just openly confessed to the court that she viewed her own mother-in-law not as a human being requiring care, but as a logistical obstacle to be managed and a financial reservoir to be drained for her preferred child. Then, the true turning point of the hearing arrived. The judge turned her attention to the woman sitting quietly beside me. Over the past few weeks, the transformation in Grandma Lorraine was undeniable. Free from the suffocating anxiety of my parents' house, properly hydrated, and receiving her correct medication, the frail, terrified woman on my porch had vanished. She sat upright, wearing a tailored navy blazer, her silver hair neatly brushed. "Mrs. Hart, do you have anything you wish to add to this proceeding?" the judge asked gently. Grandma Lorraine looked across the aisle. She did not look at them with hatred, but with a profound, absolute disappointment that was somehow much worse. Her voice was steady, clear, and carried no hesitation. "They never asked me what I wanted," Grandma Lorraine said, the simple words cutting through the remaining tension in the room like a newly sharpened blade. "They only told me how much I was costing them." The courtroom went dead silent. Even the frantic scribbling of the court reporter seemed to pause for a fraction of a second. That single sentence summarized the entire grotesque reality of the elder abuse dynamic. The judge did not need to hear another word. She struck her gavel with a definitive, hollow crack. She immediately ordered a full, independent forensic review of the remote notary session, citing the glaring technical discrepancies we had exposed. She issued a sweeping temporary injunction that completely froze every single transaction, wire transfer, and withdrawal related to any asset bearing my grandmother's name. Furthermore, she granted my petition in full. I was legally awarded emergency, exclusive proxy over all of her medical and care decisions. Randall, Beth, and Mason were legally barred from contacting her, her banking institutions, or her medical providers. The immediate dynamic had violently flipped, The people who thought they held all the cards were suddenly locked out of the casino entirely. They had lost all access to the money they so desperately needed to keep their lies afloat. As we packed our briefcases and stood to leave the courtroom, I felt a deep, resonant wave of satisfaction. The gears of justice were finally grinding forward, and they were crushing the intricate illusions my parents had spent months building. But as I walked past their table, I caught a glimpse of my father's eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the dark, cornered panic of a man who was out of options and out of time. He was whispering furiously to his lawyer, his hands trembling with rage. The temporary ruling was a massive tactical victory, but my professional instincts were screaming a heavy warning in the back of my mind. The true knot was not yet untangled. My parents were not the type of people to simply accept defeat and walk away quietly. They were desperate, and desperate people do not care about court orders. I could feel it in the cold air of the hallway. They still believed there was a back door, a hidden loophole, or a way to corner her into signing one final piece of paper. The legal battle had just begun, but the psychological war was about to reach its absolute breaking point. Exactly 3 weeks after the probate judge slammed her gavel and froze their entire world, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in my locked mailbox. It bore no return address, but my name was written across the front in my mother's unmistakable, sweeping cursive. Inside the envelope was a 2-page handwritten letter. On the surface, it was an absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation. Beth wrote that they were utterly broken, that they had lost everything, and that the silence between us was tearing their hearts apart. She begged for a chance to see Grandma Lorraine one last time, just to apologize in person and begin healing our fractured family before it was too late. I sat at my kitchen island, reading the tear-stained ink, and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical suspicion. In my line of work, sudden contrition from a hostile target is rarely genuine. It is almost always a calculated, desperate tactical pivot when their primary strategy violently fails. Marcus, my attorney, took exactly one look at the scanned copy I forwarded to him and instantly identified the play. My parents were not seeking spiritual absolution or family healing. They were hunting for a signature. They desperately needed a notarized withdrawal of our legal petition, or perhaps a new, fraudulently obtained authorization form to release the frozen funds. The financial discovery process we had initiated was finally bearing heavy fruit, exposing the absolute, crushing desperation driving their fake apology. Through subpoenas, we uncovered the commercial leasing contracts Mason had signed for his grandiose athletic complex. In his blind, unchecked arrogance, my brother had signed massive, ironclad personal financial guarantees for the sprawling retail space and the imported recovery equipment. But his signature alone was not enough for the commercial landlords. He lacked the actual collateral. So, Randall and Beth had proudly co-signed the documents as his secondary financial guarantors. With the massive annuity permanently frozen by the court order and their initial deposits entirely forfeited, a small army of aggressive creditors and corporate collection agencies was now actively hunting all three of them. They were no longer just embarrassed. They were staring down the barrel of total, inescapable bankruptcy. If I needed any further proof that their emotional letter was a cynical Trojan horse, I received a quiet phone call from my aunt later that same evening. She nervously confessed that Beth had been secretly calling extended family members all week, aggressively probing to see if Grandma Lorraine had any hidden, secondary bank accounts. Beth had even loudly accused me of hoarding a massive, secret fortune for myself. The healing family narrative was a complete sham. They were just rattling the remaining cages, desperately hoping some loose change would fall out. Marcus proposed a brilliant, incredibly dangerous countermove. We would agree to a formal settlement conference. We would put everyone in the exact same room. But it would be held at Marcus's corporate law firm, heavily supervised, and officially recorded under standard legal mediation rules. We were going to hand them the rope. All they had to do was tie the knot themselves. The conference room was encased in thick, soundproof glass, the heavy mahogany table practically radiating tension. Randall and Beth walked in looking visibly aged. The crushing stress of impending financial ruin had completely stripped away their polished, country club exterior. Their defense attorney looked utterly exhausted. I sat perfectly still beside Marcus, while Grandma Lorraine sat at the head of the table, looking serene and completely untouched by their frantic, nervous energy. The mediation began with their lawyer offering a hollow, convoluted settlement structure. Randall could not maintain the polite facade for more than 20 minutes. The absolute silence from our side of the table deeply provoked his innate, raging arrogance. He leaned forward, aggressively tapping his index finger against the polished wood. "Listen to me, Denise," Randall demanded, his face flushing a dark, angry red. "This entire legal circus is ridiculous and unnecessary. That money was going to belong to Mason eventually anyway. It is his birthright. His inheritance. We simply borrowed it early to secure the boy's future before the business opportunity vanished. You are treating us like common street criminals over a simple family advance." I did not say a single word. I let his explicit, arrogant confession hang heavy in the air, captured permanently by the high-definition audio recording device sitting directly in the center of the table. Beth, suddenly sensing the catastrophic legal error her husband had just made, completely panicked. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. In a desperate, frantic attempt to justify their cruel actions, she entirely abandoned their established legal defense of caregiver burnout. "We had to do it that way," Beth blurted out, her voice shrill and echoing loudly off the glass walls. "We had to get her out of the house early that morning. If she had stayed in the living room, she would have gotten confused and caused a massive scene during the bank verification call. We were just trying to keep the peace so the final transfer could clear smoothly." Marcus did not even bother to cross-examine her. He just looked at me and offered a tight, deeply satisfied nod. They had just verbally admitted, on the official legal record, to premeditated financial extraction and the deliberate, forced relocation of an elder to explicitly facilitate wire fraud. They had practically written their own indictments, but the most devastating strike of the afternoon did not come from me or my attorney. It came from the woman they had severely, fatally underestimated. Grandma Lorraine calmly placed her hands flat on the mahogany table. She looked directly at her son and her daughter-in-law. The lingering pity in her eyes was entirely replaced by an unbreakable, cold resolve. "You keep talking about Mason's inheritance," Grandma Lorraine said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the heavy silence. "You assumed I was just waiting to die so you could carve up whatever was left." She reached into her structured leather handbag and produced a single, neatly folded legal document. She slid it slowly across the long table toward Randall. "I noticed the small amounts of money disappearing from my checking account long before you threw me out into the snow," she continued. "I knew exactly what you were doing behind my back. I went to a private attorney 2 years ago. I completely dissolved the old will. I restructured every single asset I own into an irrevocable, locked care trust." Randall stared at the crisp white paper, as if it were coated in toxic poison. Beth completely stopped breathing. "Denise is not inheriting a single dime to fight you over," Grandma Lorraine explained softly, delivering the final, absolute crushing blow. "She is solely the legal administrator. The trust dictates that the funds can only be dispersed directly to licensed medical providers, assisted living facilities, and authorized care services. When I pass away, whatever money is left over will immediately be donated to a designated charity. There is no inheritance. Randall, there was never going to be a final payout for Mason. You destroyed your entire life, and your son's life, to steal a vault that was already permanently emptied." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. I watched the realization physically crush the breath out of them. The frantic energy, the aggressive entitlement, the desperate manipulation, it all instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the hollow, terrifying reality of their situation. They had alienated their daughter, tortured their mother, committed multiple documented felonies, and guaranteed their own total financial ruin, and they had done it all for a massive prize that did not even exist. The walls had not just closed in, the entire foundation had collapsed directly on top of them. The final gavel fell on a crisp Tuesday morning in November, echoing with a satisfying finality through the vast, wood-paneled courtroom. This was the ultimate hearing for permanent guardianship and civil liability. Every single piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past months was laid out before the judge, forming an impenetrable, devastating mosaic of calculated abuse. The narrative was no longer disjointed. It was a perfect, horrifying timeline. We presented the security footage of my grandmother being abandoned in the freezing rain. We entered the medical records proving her vital heart medications and diuretics had been systematically withheld. We displayed the cancellation notices from her cardiologist, the fraudulent household invoices, and the undeniable paper trail showing her life savings flowing directly into Mason's doomed commercial venture. And, as the absolute death blow, Marcus played the crystal-clear audio recording from our mediation session, where both Randall and Beth explicitly confessed to their financial motives and premeditated actions. The state's forensic digital expert took the stand next, delivering a highly technical but completely damning testimony. The expert definitively confirmed that the remote online notary session fell drastically short of legal identity verification standards. The biometric facial recognition had completely failed. Furthermore, the expert traced the keystrokes and digital signatures authorizing the massive withdrawal requests directly back to the specific Internet Protocol address registered to my parents' household, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that someone else in that house had physically controlled the mouse and the keyboard. The judge, the same formidable woman from our emergency hearing, did not hold back. Her voice was a booming instrument of absolute justice as she delivered her ruling. She officially declared every single previous power of attorney, healthcare proxy, and financial authorization completely null and void. She issued a permanent, ironclad injunction barring Randall, Beth, and Mason from ever accessing my grandmother's financial accounts, her property, her medical files, or her personal care decisions without direct supervision from the court. They were entirely legally erased from her life. I was officially awarded permanent, comprehensive guardianship. The remaining balance of the massive annuity was securely transferred into an impenetrable, court-monitored eldercare trust. This trust was legally bound by strict parameters. The funds could only be utilized for my grandmother's housing, specialized medical treatment, physical therapy, safe transportation, and everyday joys, honoring both my own moral compass and my grandmother's explicit wishes. The legal structure dictated that upon her eventual passing, not a single cent of the residual funds would trickle down to the family members who had exploited her. Instead, the entirety of the remaining estate would be donated directly to a national nonprofit organization dedicated to rescuing and supporting elderly victims of financial abuse. The fallout for my family was swift, absolute, and entirely of their own making, stripped of the stolen capital. Mason's grandiose athletic complex imploded spectacularly. He lost his commercial retail lease, forfeited every single piece of imported recovery equipment to the creditors, and found himself completely drowning in insurmountable debt. Without our parents to blindly bail him out, the golden boy was finally forced to face reality. Today, Mason works a grueling hourly wage job driving a forklift in a massive, unair-conditioned distribution warehouse. For the first time in his 32 years of life, he is tasting the bitter reality of surviving on actual physical labor instead of empty promises and stolen money. Randall and Beth did not fare much better. Crushed under the weight of the massive personal financial guarantees they had co-signed for Mason, and facing severe civil penalties mandated by the state, they were forced into a desperate liquidation. They had to sell their massive suburban house, their luxury vehicles, and the country club memberships they cherished so deeply. They were forced to quietly relocate to a tiny, unremarkable apartment on the other side of the state, entirely exiled from the wealthy social circles they had used to paint their fake masterpiece of a perfect family. They became a living, breathing cautionary tale for the kind of people who only pretend to have morals until the bright lights of an investigation expose their true nature. Meanwhile, The atmosphere inside my own home completely transformed. Free from the suffocating terror of her previous environment, Grandma Lorraine blossomed in a way I never thought possible. With consistent, nutritious meals and properly managed medications, the terrible swelling in her legs completely vanished. She walks steadily now, without the agonizing pain that used to bind her to a chair. The silence in the house was replaced by the smooth, vibrant sounds of classic jazz records playing in the afternoons. She joined a local community center, taking weekly watercolor painting classes, and she spends her mornings tending to a beautiful collection of culinary herbs she planted in terracotta pots on my back patio. Most importantly, she stopped apologizing every single time she needed a glass of water or a little help reaching a high shelf. She finally realized she was not a burden. She was a beloved human being who deserved to take up space. Exactly 1 year after that horrifying March morning, my life came completely full circle. It was just past 5 o'clock in the morning, the sky still pitch black, when the familiar piercing chime of my security app echoed through my quiet bedroom. My heart instantly seized in my chest, a phantom echo of the panic I had felt 12 months prior. I threw off my quilt, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor, and marched toward the front door, bracing myself for another nightmare. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The freezing morning air bit at my cheeks, but there was no silver sport utility vehicle idling in the driveway. There were no haphazardly packed duffel bags abandoned on the concrete. There was no frail, terrified elderly woman shivering in a thin nightgown. Instead, sitting perfectly center on my welcome mat, was a small, neatly taped, cardboard delivery box. I picked it up and read the shipping label. It was a brand new pair of high-quality, supportive walking shoes that Grandma Lorraine had ordered for herself from an outdoor catalog. I stood on the porch, holding the small box, and let out a long, shuddering breath that quickly turned into a quiet laugh. The freezing cold they had once weaponized to throw away a human life had ultimately transformed into the very catalyst for their total destruction. They thought the cold would break her, but it only broke them. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy journey. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Leave a like and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.